When you went through the guide and selected meaningful leadership, then my assumption would be that many of you are in leadership positions. How many of you guys are in leadership positions? Whether a manager, supervisor, director, literally our mayor pro tem in here, that's like that's the leadership of the leadership ship. But also informal leadership capacities. How many of you guys sit on boards or sit on, I see a lot of you at Las Cruces Public School people sit on SAT teams, committees, special education, IEP teams. Those are all leadership roles and positions. And so I'm glad that you chose this presentation. I was challenged by my director. So I'll go into myself a little bit. I was challenged by my director to do a presentation on Dare to Lead, mostly because we, at FYI, we took the time, or I took the time, I guess, to really assess what was our need around leadership. And I'll go into that a little bit. So I was super nervous, and it was kind of it was a challenge for her, but also kind of a directive. So I don't know if many of you guys know Jolene Martinez in the community, and she's a fierce leader. And she definitely leads with passion and from the heart. And when she makes a suggestion, it's normally a directive. And I think she might have learned that from you, Cassandra, as her leader at CYFD. Yes, so we have some presentation objectives, and really I want to be super just humble and vulnerable and say that really my objective of the presentation was just really to share with others our journey in Dare to Lead and how we have started to create a more vulnerable and courageous culture at our agency in terms of all of our caseworkers, our managers, our directors, how we provide supervision, how Michelle and I provide both staff casing, case staffings, and how we provide reflective supervision. It is really rooted in courage and vulnerability. The presentation really was just to inspire others to explore using courage and vulnerability framework in their agencies, but especially in child welfare programming and supervision. And when I consider child welfare, I don't just think CYFD, CPS. I think schools, juvenile justice, anybody who works with children. Oftentimes, I think we take child welfare and we put it in a box and we say, oh, that's child protective services, or oh, that's treatment foster care. And it's not. Child welfare is anybody who deals with children and works with children. So I encourage this framework for you all. So little disclaimer, I am not a trained Dare to Lead facilitator. That is my goal. I'm waiting for Brene Brown to open up that section on her Dare to Lead hub where I can become a Dare to Lead trained facilitator. So this presentation is really only informational on how we used it and use the Dare to Lead framework to cultivate leadership change. And you can find all things Dare to Lead at the Brene Brown website if you haven't visited it. So a little bit about my formal expertise. I was challenged with using this word expertise because when I first had I had Mateo, one of our other directors, go through the slides for me. Well, first of all, let me just disclose that it was really ugly colors, the first PowerPoint I did. It was like orange and brown, and he was like, who are you? Are you one of those pumpkin spice fall persons? Like, get rid of the orange and the brown. And I was like, okay. So another great reason to be an LGBTQ ally. He's amazing. So he was like, no, girl, you got to get rid of the brown and the orange. It's not going to work. It's going to depress people. So I changed our colors, and ironically, I chose the colors of our agency, so that was super cool. But so he challenged me because I had put up there, I had just put like a little bit about me or something, and he was like, no, girl, this is your expertise. And that was challenging to me because I felt like I'm not an expert in anything, right? So often all of us, teachers, social workers, all of us that sit at the table who do any type of formal work with people, we feel like we're not experts. Like, I am not the expert, right? Cassandra, you did it just now. Like, the mayor pro tem, she's like, I'm just a social worker, right? And I think we discount our expertise. And so he challenged me. He was like, leave it there. Don't move it. And I said, okay, I'm going to leave it there. So I carry a Bachelor of Social Work. I graduated in 2005 with my Bachelor in Social Work from NMSU. Shortly after that, about 5 years, I got my master's of social work. I'm independently licensed. After that, I worked for about 7 years with Las Cruces Public Schools and a little bit in Gadsden, which was probably one of my favorite places to work. In Gadsden, the culture there is just amazing. But I did some work as a school social worker in a counselor capacity at Lynn Middle Schools, where I really started my journey. And then I did some work around special education. So I was a SPED therapist. You guys call them SPED interventionists now. I'm not really sure what they're titled. And I did that at Vista for a little while. And then I finished out my career at Las Cruces Public Schools as an attendance liaison. And really what we did there is just really went into the homes and provided supports to families who were really struggling with getting their kids to school. Aside all of this, because social workers, as we know, don't get paid, the big bucks. So I think all of us have 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 jobs. So I also adjunct professor at NMSU School of Social Work, where I've taught Intro to Social Work primarily since 2011. I've taught human behavior in the social environment, and I've also taught policy, which was not one of my favorite classes at all. So I'm also a New Mexico board certified supervisor for social workers and for other clinical specialties. So I provide clinical supervision to those seeking their licensure. I'm a recent board member for New Mexico Behavioral Health Providers Association, another encouragement/directive. So I joined that board here just recently, which is really cool because in the behavioral health world, it's really giving us a kind of a leg up on like what are the changes with Medicaid and how can we support families and things like that. So what I'm learning from that lesson, that it's important to get on these, to have your voice heard on these boards. I also am trained in trust-based relational intervention. I'm trained in trauma-focused CBT, and I'm a recent trained facilitator of making sense of your worth. And as we roll out more trainings from FYI, you'll start to see that come out more. So look for those trainings available to other people in the community. So a little bit about my lived expertise. This is my family. So my daughter Alyssa's in the front. She's also standing back there in the back. She also works for FYI as a peer influencer. I've got my husband, and I have 2 biological children that belong to me, that I birthed. And then I have 2 children that belong to my husband. So we're definitely a non-traditional blended family. It was a hard, bumpy road. There was times that we thought, what the heck did we do? We had no business joining family that had children 1 year apart from each other. And so that was an interesting time. But the reason why I put my lived expertise on here mostly is because in the work in vulnerability and courage, it takes a lot to put yourself out there. And so one of the things I was challenged to do was really talk about my lived experience and the importance of the lived experience. And so when I think about my lived experience, I have an indigenous heritage. Part of my being is from the Polynesian culture, which is very rooted in indigenous practices. I had a teen pregnancy. Alyssa probably didn't know that about me, but I had a teen pregnancy. I've been a single mother. I've been an adoptive mother. I've been a mother of system-involved and LGBTQ population youth. And I was a non-traditional college student. I got my degree at 30 and 35. I just, I waited, I guess, to get my degree. But there's a reason why this is important, and I think I mention it because my lived experience is equally as valuable and important as my higher formal education and the letters behind my name. In fact, I think my lived experience have probably taught me more in my life than my higher education. My higher education just gave me experiences and definitions and language to my lived experiences. So I felt like those were important things to share about me. So, sorry, my slides look a little funky. So FYI's mission really is a little bit about FYI. So our mission is really to promote a safer and healthier community by focus on families and children. By serving really individuals, youth, and families, we serve them in innovative youth services, health and nutrition, health and prevention programs, child welfare intervention and prevention programs, treatment foster care, clinical therapy, housing and shelter, and God, Brian, did I forget? A couple other things, I'm sorry. We serve a lot of things. Yeah, thank you. So a little bit about our Dare to Lead journey. So when I sat with Jolene, when I was really putting this presentation together, she sent me this, and it just struck me. And because I told her, well, what am I really doing? What am I focusing on? And she said, equity can only be achieved if we transparently and vulnerably discuss what is oppressing us. And truth-telling is central to all of the populations we work with. And doing this requires vulnerability and courage. We can't truth-tell without courage, right? How many of us can just give our personal, situations without courage, right? So when I started at the agency, I started in 2018. I had left the schools. Somehow Jolene convinced me to leave 3 months of vacation a year and 2 weeks at Christmas and more pay to come to FYI. And she was like, I promise you it'll be a blessing, it'll be an amazing journey. And she has a way of doing that, of really convincing you to come over. And then you get there for a little bit and you're like, what in the hell happened? What am I doing? And that's kind of the way I felt. But she brought me on as a child welfare prevention supervisor. And during this time frame, she brought me in. She was very transparent, and she said, this team needs a lot of work. This team needs a lot of work. There's a possibility that we may lose this contract. We need to get in there and assess and dig around. This is my first experience with adaptive leadership. So I didn't have the greatest experience with adaptive leadership at first. It was hard. So I came in as a supervisor, and I had never been in a formal capacity, a leader or a supervisor. I had been on SAT teams, and I had been, kind of this informal leader among peers and stuff like that, but never really supervised a staff. And so what I found was there was this need to create team. The team was very fragmented. Cynthia G is here. She was a part of that first team. Her and I came in a day apart, and I'm sure she had a lot of the same, like, what is happening here? What did I get myself into? But I really assessed the need of the team and began to assess the need really agency-wide by observing both informally, in discussion with people, in surveys and observations. And really, we started to discover this need, that there was this need for reflective supervision. And then Jolene really worked at setting up programming supervision, where she would provide to our supervisors programmatic supervision, and I would provide reflective supervision. So really the way it was set up was like, Jolene gets to tell you what to do, and then you can go cry about it to Lisa. so that's really the way it was set up, and it was rough because what we found is I started containing a lot for the agency, and really had to talk to her about how do I move through this? How do I get through? I didn't know how. Michelle hadn't yet joined our team yet and taught us how. so she was still pre-Michelle. So really what I started to observe was that the team really didn't know how to process what they were feeling around their cases. And if you've ever worked in CPS, child welfare, and even though I never worked for CYFD in the system, this was similar work. We were contracted. We were an extension of CYFD, and we were expected to provide those in-home intervention services. And so what I started to see about my staff is they couldn't process their experiences. They couldn't, they would come and they would close out cases right away, and they would say, oh, the family's just not engaging. They're disengaged, they just don't want to answer us. And they started having all these really short answers to cutting families off. And I started to think, like, what is happening? And so we started to institute reflective supervision a little bit at a time, which was very new for this staff. One, nobody really asked them, how do you feel after they did a home visit? Nobody had really asked them, is there anything coming up for you? Is there anything that's coming up that may have triggered you in that home visit? Or are you showing up in a defense? Or, what is it that you're feeling now? Do you need to be put in timeout? Do I need to send you home because you probably shouldn't be on another home visit? Nobody had really done that. It was just move, work, right? And so in those reflective supervisions is where we really started practicing vulnerability. And I was really attempting to get staff to reflect deeper on what they were experiencing in the case. And I didn't really have a framework for it or language. And so really their child welfare cases required vulnerability, and they didn't seem to know how. And they seem to be missing accountability. I don't mean accountability to like, oh, your billings due. Well, they were kind of missing a little bit of that too, the programmatic pieces. I mean accountability to themselves, to their personal work. Many of them had never engaged in self-reflection or personal work, and so they were missing accountability to themselves. And so really there was a need. There was a need there. And so how many of you guys have read Dare to Lead or any Brené Brown work? Okay, so I picked up a book. Jolene had introduced me to a little bit of Brené Brown stuff, and I noticed she had a book that came out, and I thought, I need something. I need like a leadership map, like I just need something. So I picked up the book, and one of the biggest things that stood out to me was there was this quote in there that says, what gets in the way becomes the way. And I was like, holy moly. We are in our own way. We are in our own way in this team, in this group. And I started to think, surely if this is just in our team, surely it's in other teams, right? Because at the time when I started with FYI, things were pretty siloed. No, there was a lot of teams that weren't working together or as cohesively as they probably could have been. And so it was really hard to determine, like, I wonder if other people are experiencing that. So we did. We started to talk to other supervisors, and they were also feeling unequipped and upset that their staff were feeling the same. So what I did was I read the book, and then I organized our first 2 cohorts for program supervisors. And the intent was really to ensure that they could learn and grow from each other and from their strengths. I wanted them to create community and support systems because we were finding that I was just inundated with people just coming and taking and from my cup, and I couldn't refill my cup quick enough. And some supervisors were new, and some had been there for many years. So the real work began, right? So we started 2 cohorts. And one of the things we found in here, one of the quotes that I put in here because I really liked it, was that daring leadership is a collection of 4 skill sets that are teachable, observable, and measurable. And rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, and braving trust, and learning to rise. So what we did was we started the new cohorts. And what I first had them do was take a survey. So there's a pre-survey on the Dare to Lead website. And it really just assesses your skills in those 4 components. And then we implemented the 8-week course together in 2 separate cohorts. And then at the very end, we took a post survey, or I sent it out for them to do the post survey. So this is what we really started to find. And my CEO is sitting in here, so I'm super vulnerable. And actually, Brian, you were the first one I shared these findings with. But there was 2 major themes that stood out in our cohorts that I started to find. The first was that staff had difficulty both hearing and having tough conversations. The importance around this because of the type of work we do in childcare. If we can't have tough conversations, then how do we move the work forward? And not even just in child welfare, in any agency that we're working for, right? And some of the things that they had said to me was not knowing a direction or expectation for leadership. It's difficult to grow when we don't receive feedback. This is how we've always done it mentality. We had a lot of that, right? So some leadership among us felt very unequipped to have tough conversations. Under-equipped, fear of people in positions of assumed authority, right? So there was this culture that people were really afraid to speak to, and that's what we started to uncover. The other thing was really a lack in communication, and I think a lot of agencies and a lot of larger, the schools or the state, I think this is a common thing for a lot of people. I don't want to say that this is like unusual or anything like that. I think lack of communication can be a big deal. So really, some of the things they said around that were, people in the agency spend too much time talking about past issues with no sense of how to move beyond them. Or we spent more time rehabilitating our families, but leadership spends no time rehabilitating employees after change. And Michelle spoke to that in her presentation. How are we grounding and taking care of our staff so that they can stand in the gaps for our people, right? So I'm going to show this quick little clip.
Best-selling author and social researcher. Her name is Brene Brown. She burst into public consciousness with her TED Talk in 2010. The power of vulnerability remains the site's fourth most popular talk. Listen to this, it has 36 million views. Wow, today, Brene Brown is busy juggling consulting and speaking events at Fortune 500 companies, including IBM, Disney, and Google. Her new book focuses on how each of us can cultivate effective leadership. It's called Dare to Lead. Great work, tough conversations, cold hearts. Brene Brown joins us once again. First on CBS This Morning to talk about her latest book. It's always good to have you at the table, Brene Brown. Good morning.
It is a masterpiece. I love it. I love it.
Just the fact that you've had 36 million views says to me that people are very open to finding out more about this. But I know very few bosses and leaders that think it's okay to show vulnerability. But you say you can't have courage without vulnerability. What do you mean?
You know, it's interesting because I used to spend a lot of time when I go into these companies kind of evangelizing about vulnerability, it's important. Then one day I found myself on a military base talking to special forces. And I just asked a simple question. Give me an example of courage that you've seen or witnessed in your life, or that you've done yourself, that didn't require uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, which is the definition of vulnerability. Give me a single example of courage that did not require that. And there was just silence until one guy just raised his hand and said, 3 tours, ma'am, there is no courage without vulnerability. And so now I just ask audiences that simple question. Give me an example of courage that doesn't require uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure.
You say most people think of courage as a...
Okay. So can any of you give me an example of courage that doesn't require uncertainty and emotional exposure? It requires emotional insecurity, right? Yes. Okay, it requires courage. So when I went through those four pillars that she talks about that are a learned skill set, these are some of the things that we found when we started. So some of the things I found were that we avoided tough conversations, including giving honest and productive feedback. That was a huge barrier. None of us could really find our way to say, dude, you're out of your lane, or that was terrible. That assessment was not really good. Like, none of us had the courage to really, I shouldn't say none. Some of us did. But that seemed to be something that was a problem. Rather than spending a reasonable amount of time proactively acknowledging and addressing the fears and feelings of others that show up during change and upheaval, we spend an unreasonable amount of time managing problematic behaviors. I think supervisors across the board were feeling like they were managing behaviors more than they were addressing the behavior. And these are all of Brene Brown's words. So once you do that assessment and once you go through the work, some themes may emerge for you guys. Our organization, the other thing that emerged for us were our organizational values were gauzy and assessed in terms of aspirations rather than actual behaviors that could be taught, measured, or evaluated. And after that, our leadership did do a lot of work, our executive leadership did do a lot of work around really creating our values and our pillars and things like that. And so it helped propel us. It helped propel us forward. So. Okay, so what did some of those things teach us? So I think when we went through the Dare to Lead work, these were some of the things, when we looked at those 4 pillars, some of the things that the Dare to Lead work taught us. It helped us to define vulnerability, internally reflect on our own values around vulnerability and courage, identify how we armor up. In her book, she defines really armoring up is really our defense mechanisms, right? How do we respond to people when somebody is bringing a courageous and vulnerable topic to us? Do we shut down? Do we get defensive? Do we come in high defense? And trust me, we still come in with all of these things. We're just now more aware of them. And some of us make each other, I think Michelle and I do this a lot with each other. We mirror each other a lot of our behavior, and so sometimes I can be like, I'll text her in a meeting and be like, hey, you're a little defensive. She's like, oh, we have to carry each other. Yeah. So it also showed us how do we armor up? How do we understand shame and empathy? How do we stay curious in those situations that require us to be courageous? And mostly it taught us how to rumble with each other safely, because there is no getting to a solution without rumbling. And if you're not rumbling safely around things, then you're not moving the work forward, and you're not getting the gritty facts. You're not getting down to what needs to be changed. And Cassandra, you talked about this a little bit in your keynote in terms of adaptive leadership, that it takes a community to understand these concepts to move the work forward. And it's the same in here. It takes us to be able to understand why, and getting underneath the behaviors people are so afraid to speak out, right? It also, in the area of living into your values, this part was really great for us, I thought. It helped us to identify our own values. It takes some time through the workbook, and you reflect through your own values. And then it also led us into conversations around what we thought our agency values were. And you'd be surprised how many people were way off. Like, some people thought, oh, this is what the agency values, and oh, this is what the agency values. And all of us had these collective different opinions, right? But mostly, in living into your values, what we learned was clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And I think if anybody's taken the brunt of clear is kind, is Jolene, because Jolene is not always the clearest person. And so we've always had to hold her to clear is kind, or not just her, but each other, right? Like having to circle back around and say, I'm not really clear on that, right? And really having to hold to that value and learning that that value is important to make sure that people walk away understanding what we're asking them or asking of them as their leadership, right? We learned ways to ensure that we stay planted in our values when it's hard, and how to hold each other accountable to those values. And that is hard. And we've been about maybe a year and a half out of the Dare to Lead framework, and it continues to be hard. And it's very easy to go back into old patterns of behavior. And so I often have to pull out my Dare to Lead book. I don't even know if I brought it. Show it to you. Yeah. My Dare to Lead book with all the highlights and everything in it. I often have to refer back to it. In our Braving Trust, I think it helped us to learn to trust ourselves and those that we lead. It taught us how to choose courage over comfort, really choose courage over comfort, and choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy. And that's hard, because it's always easier to choose what's fun, fast, and easy. And it taught us how to practice our values, not just profess them. And so it's one thing to do a lot of lip service and a lot of talking about what you're going to do, and it's a whole other thing to really lean into what you should be doing. And then it taught us the learning to rise part, helped us to learn how that our own truths, or how to own our own truths and our stories, and it be okay. It's okay to have those lived experiences. It's okay to not carry shame in some of my own lived experiences and bring those to the table. It was never about disclosure. I think there's this fear that, oh, vulnerability is disclosure. And I think one of the things Brené Brown does so brilliantly is that it's never about disclosure, and people can really have a whole courageous, vulnerable conversation and not disclose one thing about themselves, and that's amazing. So it really helped us to learn really how to own those truths about ourselves, how our experiences play out in our everyday work lives. I think Michelle's been a huge teacher of that to me. When my own experiences are playing out in work life and supervision, or, she's been able, in my supervision with her, she'll be able to stop me and say, is that your shit, or is that theirs? So it's sometimes in supervision, you have to sort through that, like, wait a minute, is this my stuff, or is that their stuff? And what do I leave behind? We heard, recently we had a lady come and talk to us about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social workers have always had the saying, meet people where they're at. But she did this brilliant spin, and she said, sometimes you have to meet people where they're at, and sometimes you have to leave them there. And I was like, man, I was just tattoo that on me, because, yeah, sometimes you got to just leave people where they're at, right? They're not going to come along with us. So, so it helped us. Yeah, so it helped. There are casualties. So it helped us to learn our own truths and stories. It helped us see how we shape what we want to see through vulnerability and courage, and taught us how to model more of what we want to see. And I took that from Michelle. So one of the lesson Michelle teaches all of us is that we model what we want to see more of. We shine light on what we want to see more of, and so we don't stay hindered in the past and in mistakes that we've made. Right? Any questions so far? Go ahead. This is Michelle. Michelle is our assistant clinical director, and she did a presentation earlier on attachment. And so if you guys get a chance, I think she's going to present again on that. So, yeah, Michelle's my rock at work sometimes. I need for her to be. Okay, let's see. All right, so I did a I am by no means a data person, and Brian's even probably going to cringe at this because he's very much a data detective. So he's always questioning any data we bring to him, right? So I'll just be very honest and vulnerable. So really, I surveyed we did a few cohorts, and 10 of my supervisors or our supervisors responded back in leadership. And so really these are 9, 7, and 8 out of 10 respondents, right? And so very informal data. But really this was based on that Dare to Lead assessment. So what we did was we took the assessment they took in the beginning, and then we took the post. And really it was cool because 9 out of the 10 really talked about how they reported an increased confidence in skills and rumbling with vulnerability, meaning they had the ability to come to the table and not feel so afraid to really talk about, even if it was scary, they could still get it on the table at least, right? And they could expect to be met with safety, right? That we weren't going to shut them down or say, that's crazy, you shouldn't feel that way, or invalidate them in any way. 7 of the 10 reported increased skills and confidence in leaning into their values, and 7 of the 10 reported increased skills and confidence in braving trust. To me, this was interesting to see this lower number, and it speaks a lot to me, and actually, Michelle doesn't know this, but it's on our next supervision, but I really want to sort through that. I want to find out what's underneath that. Why do they feel the ability that they can be vulnerable and can come and rumble at a table about something, but they're not sure about their own value set or leaning into their values, and they're not super sure about braving trust, right? And then 80% of them, or 8 out of 10, reported increased confidence in the skill in learning to rise. So it tells me that they were able to really think about, okay, I can go and I can rumble with vulnerability, not really sure yet about leaning into my values and the other things, but I think that I can get up. And I think that's kind of what I took from that very informal data, Brian. He gave me the thumbs up. So really, these were some of the things we also did. Jessica from our LC3 collaborative helped me put together a very 3-question, open-ended, qualitative question survey for the cohorts, and these were some of the things we got back. What did you gain from the Dare to Lead training? How to sit through discomfort, how to recognize my own shields, and most importantly, how to bring my worth to the table and have a real brave, courageous conversation with anyone. I gained insight into leadership perspectives at the agency, a shared language for leading, and a greater awareness of areas for growth in my own leadership. I learned that speaking up with courage, although it's not easy, yields better results than staying quiet and building resentment. That was huge. I wish I wouldn't have done this anonymously, because then I could have seen like, oh, who are my supervisors that have learned all these things? I learned that speaking up with courage, although it's not easy, yields better results than staying quiet and building resentment. Truly daring leaders, and this was how did Dare to Lead change the way you supervise or work in general. So truly daring leaders, she explains, are prepared to be vulnerable and listen without interrupting. They have empathy, connecting to emotions that underpin an experience, not just to the experience itself. They have self-awareness and self-love because who we are is how we lead. It truly has changed me to lead with an open heart and mind, especially when we are leaning into conflict and or courageous conversations. I'm more willing to speak up when I have a different idea than the group, and I'm more open to listening to other people's points of view. I have greater understanding of what our higher level leadership is trying to accomplish and how. I try to be more generous in my thoughts. For example, instead of creating a negative narrative about how someone may have made me feel, I try to reframe the thought so that I leave the intentionality of the person out. That's huge, and I struggle with that often, because often I'm on the defense and like, what do they mean? what do they mean by that? Like, why are they looking at me like that, you know? Giving clear direction is truly kind, not beating around the bush. And then these were some things about how they felt like it impacted them. So you guys can read those. Improve their sense of self-worth. Just some really, really profound experiences, I think, that impacted them personally, which I thought was pretty profound. Because the Dare to Lead work was not just about the agency, right? Because all of us bring our personal experiences into work, every single one of us. And so I think some of us that are older, we learned you don't bring those experiences to work. Everything is separate. But what you learn in this field is that it's not separate. We have to be intentional about owning our truths, our feelings, and being able to separate them from the work. But it takes true, hard intentionality to do that. So there's just some more. There's a single mama there. Yes, Cynthia.
What you stated was like right before I was about to raise my hand. Being one of the older, I was raised as a child that in the Hispanic, I'm going to say in my Hispanic family, that children are seen and not heard. Mm-hmm. And then I go into the field, and I've been a supervisor probably since I was 16 years old, and have supervised. This is what you do. I don't want to hear it. If you don't want to get on the bus and do what we need to do, then we will leave you behind. And so that's just the way it is. And I did it like that for over
30 years.
Mm-hmm. If not longer.
Yes.
So when this did come up, I was like, you want to know what my feelings and my opinions are? Well, why? I want to do this job. This job is perfect. But then I started realizing that, why did that upset me? Mm-hmm. I'm not even involved. It has nothing to do with me, but yet I'm upset. You start thinking and becoming much more aware, self-aware. And it was very eye-opening, I want to say, especially for someone as old as I am. And it has helped immensely, even though I was one of those people that was trained, taught, raised, and imprinted on my forehead that,
I love that
we do what we are directed to do.
Yes.
And do not ask questions.
Yeah, many of us were, and I think that's probably why I sit on a lot of things that I probably don't have time for, because it's still embedded with me, right? You do what you're directed to do. Cynthia was a part of one of our first cohorts, and we had 2 of them. And backing up, I'll just tell you, we did this Dare to Lead work right at the height of the pandemic. So Brian packed us all up, sent us home, and then we were all like, "Pulse, what do we do now?" We didn't know what to do with each other. And so Michelle was like, well, we should do support cohorts for people. And then I was like, well, we're going to do our Dare to Lead work. Because at first, I think if you guys remember, I pumped the brakes. And I was like, no way. There's no way we're going to do vulnerability work while we're all vulnerable at home. And then in my supervision with Jolene, when I said that to her out loud, I knew once I said it, I was like, oh, she's going to get me. And she did, and she just kind of tilted her head, and she was like, but is that true, though? Like, shouldn't we be doing the vulnerability work while we're vulnerable at home? And I was like, damn it, I'm going to have to lead it. And we did. We jumped in, and it was hard, but everybody showed up. Everybody showed up once a week for 2 hours. We did this for 2 hours, and we left there, talk about dysregulated. Michelle had to do so many calming things before, after, during. Like, we were always breathing, doing heart math. You know, she was always like, oh, let's just slow down. Let's heart math. And we're like, yes, it's heart math, you know, because we were so dysregulated during that pandemic. It was so hard and just vulnerable to just be raw. And so these were things that I felt like we got out of this. And there are a few of you in the room that went through this, and maybe you can speak to it. But it was an adaptive challenge and a technical challenge. And so... and mind you, right after we did Dare to Lead, Jolene thrust us into adaptive leadership, which was a whole other experience. Maybe I'll do a presentation on that one another time. But we also learned that it required upper leadership to step into the values that we identified in Dare to Lead. There was a lot of conversations with Brian and executive leadership around just Dare to Lead in general and the language that we were learning. We implemented the language and tools and reflective supervision as well as programmatic supervision. We didn't do this in a formal technical way. I think you had mentioned having a form, right? If there was a form that could fix everything, we try. Michelle and I try to make forms as adaptive as we can, but really we just started adapting this language. I ran 2 more cohorts. I run a total of 4 cohorts in there, and we offered it to people that were not necessarily in leadership in leadership roles. We began modeling it by using the language and the tools. One of the tools that I use all the time, and that I use with my leaders who come to me and say, I got to talk to so and so, and this is what they're doing, and they're already coming to me in that. With judgment. So then I'll tell them, do you remember the engaged feedback checklist? And they're like, oh. And then they'll just walk out of my office, They're like, forget it, come back and see me when you have that engaged feedback checklist. And for those of you guys who are curious and you get online, it's really a list of 10 things that really describe and say, am I ready to give feedback? And one of the biggest things on there that I think that stood out to me on that feedback checklist was, if I'm not ready to sit next to you instead of across from you, then I'm not ready to give you feedback. If I'm not ready to just be in it with you and really talk to you, then I have to check myself because I'm not ready. And so there's all these other things on that feedback checklist that'll tell you whether or not you're ready. Supervisors learn to create safety for their staff, and in turn, staff is learning to model that for the people they serve. So we still have a ways to go. It's still challenging, but getting easier. We've only really just begun, and we continue to engage in leadership development. It's a value for us. It's now a value for us. And like I said, we went into adaptive leadership after that. Mateo's getting ready to run us through championship culture. So there's a lot of ways that we continue that value of developing our people in leadership, because it's not just our leaders, it's also about our people who are staff who are out there representing our agency. We want them to have our embedded values and our language and what we're sharing at the agency, because that's how you move the community forward. That's how you move the change. So, let me see what time I have, because I wanted to show a quick video clip. Okay, I have enough time. So let's talk a little bit. Is the culture climate of your agency consistent with the values of vulnerability and courage? And how do you think these values fit into child welfare work or the work with families? So maybe some interactive, what do you guys think? And maybe your bosses might be here and you might not really want to say, and that's okay too. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm thinking about, so I work for the city of Las Cruces, and many parts of the city of Las Cruces are very hierarchical in structure, and I think, and I work for a section that is working with kids and teens and the welfare of community members, et cetera. And sometimes I find that to be a disconnect or a conflict, certainly, in how we operate within the larger organization of the city as a hierarchical government organization, and how we really get down into the nitty-gritty of working with kids and working with families and empowering a team to be able to do that effectively. I think there's definitely a disconnect in terms of the culture of where I work.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, safe enough and vulnerable enough with your mayor pro tem sitting here. Yeah. I think that exists in especially larger organizations, city leadership, state leadership. any type of agency that has to answer, like NMSU or, people where there's that culture is just a little bit harder to shift. I think we've been really fortunate at our agency because Brian has been very, very supportive in many of the directions that we want to take, and there's very little pushback from him, or very little where he pumps his brakes and says, "Hey, you got to stop," or whatever. He really gives us a lot of autonomy to explore, as long as we're not, hurting each other or hurting others, or that it's pushing our mission forward, right? How about those of you guys in child welfare working for the schools or CYFD? Do you feel like those values around vulnerability and courage fit into that work? Do you think it's important? Go ahead, Christina.
So just having come from child welfare, doing it for 5 years and then doing something other than that, yes. So I think it definitely goes hand in hand. And I think if we were doing that when I was there, I think it would have made a huge difference in, the way that I spoke to my kids, or the way that I spoke to the foster parents, or the way that I engaged with the court systems. I think it would have made a huge difference if we were able to incorporate that with staff, foster parents, anybody really who had a relationship with the children that I had on my caseload.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that once we were able to go through the work, it definitely shifted the way I did supervision, even in just our child welfare prevention team. It just changed things. It changed my direction to them in terms of case staffings. Like, okay, this is what I need you to hit. And sometimes it was just one question to the family. It wasn't a checkbox like, do we have food? Do we have all these things? But more, it was like, how are you feeling today? Right? Giving staff that language to just say, you know what? I'm worried for you too. I'm nervous too. Let's talk about this. Let's put it on the table. How about anybody else? Anybody else want to? Go ahead, Cynthia.
I just wanted to say that I give Brené Brown so much credit going to companies like Google, Disney.
I know, the military.
I'm like, it's amazing because I've worked for government agencies and worked for healthcare, and it's like, to bring in an idea like this is like, no, this is going to be a waste of time, and it's not even a thought in their mind.
Yeah, and there isn't always just buy-in. Nobody's ever just willing to be like, sure, I want to be vulnerable and courageous. Like, nobody wants to just jump in and do all of that.
You give it those first few minutes, because I was right there. I was like, vulnerable with people. Yeah, I know them, but they don't need to know that much. But it's a different type of openness and vulnerability.
It really helped us create team and build team, I think. For us, especially when we were really just struggling. Okay, so as we finish up, I just want to show this quick clip. This is Cynthia Garcia. I know she was like, you stretched out my face. I didn't know how to make it fit on there better. She was my supervisor at the time that we were doing Dare to Lead in child welfare.
Hi, I just want to talk a little bit about how Dare to Lead affected my leadership style. And first of all, I will say that it affected it very positively. There were moments through that, those workshops that were very raw, were very vulnerable, they were very exposing, but in a very good way. They allowed me to do the self-work during my leadership, to give back, to lead. And what's interesting about that is that it wasn't just meant for those that were in a leadership position, so to speak, but I think in any area of our lives, how we lead is so important. Whether it's at home, in our workplace, in our communities, wherever we are at some point or another, we lead. And so it helped expose the areas that definitely needed a lot of improvement, a lot of self-reflection, a lot of work, a lot of growth. And have I implemented it today? I continuously implement. And I think the central part of that is that I engage, or at least attempt to engage in a lot of self-reflection. And I do a lot of self-inventories to ensure that the place from where I'm leading from is raw, more safely. So Dare to Lead was something so great for me and in my leadership and in that season, and it continues to be a work in progress. Thank you. Hey.
So that kind of just wraps it all up, guys. Any more questions or comments? Anything you guys want to say? I encourage you guys to pick up the book. I encourage you guys to not wait for anybody to lead. Do it. Do it yourselves. Change the culture if you need to. Thank you.